Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The morning sun glinted off the choppy surface of the Gulf of Mexico as Dr. Michael Donovan adjusted the straps on his diving equipment. At 36, Mike had spent nearly half his life studying marine predators, with a particular focus on the behavioral patterns of bull sharks along the Florida coastline. Today's dive was part of a 3-year research project tracking seasonal movements of Carcharinus lucus populations between the freshwater tributaries and saltwater habitats of Tampa Bay. "Weather report looks good," called out Justine Mercer, Mike's research assistant and doctoral candidate, as she checked the monitoring equipment on their chartered 28-foot research vessel. "Visibility should be around 30 feet. Perfect for the cameras." Mike nodded, his mind already focused on the dive ahead. This particular site, approximately 11 miles offshore from St. Petersburg, had shown increasing bull shark activity over the past month. His team had tagged 3 specimens here last week, and the tracking data suggested at least 5 distinct sharks were using this area as a feeding ground. The opportunity to observe and document their natural behavior was too valuable to miss. "Depth reading is 68 feet, said Carlos Vasquez, their boat captain and dive safety officer. "Current is running north to northeast at about half a knot. Nothing you can't handle, but keep an eye on it." "Thanks, Carlos." Mike double-checked his underwater camera housing, ensuring the waterproof seals were secure. The high-definition video equipment represented nearly $15,000 of university grant money, but the footage it could capture was priceless to their research. "Remember, we're observing only today. No tagging, no specimen collection. Just beautiful footage of beautiful killing machines," Justine said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Despite her academic enthusiasm, she'd never fully shaken her unease around the powerful predators. "They're not machines, Justine. They're perfectly evolved organisms following instinctual patterns that have kept their species alive for millions of years." Mike's correction was gentle, but firm. "If we're going to protect them and minimize human-shark conflicts, we need to understand those patterns better." Carlos checked Mike's equipment one final time. "Dive computer is set. Emergency beacon is functioning. You've got about 2 hours of air, but standard protocol is to surface at 90 minutes. "I'll be up in 60, Mike assured him. The AE plan was straightforward. Descend to the seafloor, set up the stationary camera array, and then position himself at a safe observational distance. If the bull sharks appeared, he would document their movements, feeding patterns and interactions. If not, the stationary cameras would continue recording for 6 hours, potentially capturing behavior when humans weren't present." Mike pulled his neoprene hood over his head, inserted his regulator, and performed a final check of his buoyancy compensator. With a thumbs up to Justine and Carlos, he rolled backward off the boat and into the warm waters of the Gulf. The initial descent was always disorienting, a transition from one world to another. Mike equalized the pressure in his ears every few feet, watching the dancing sun rays from the surface gradually dim as he dropped deeper. The visibility was good, perhaps 35 feet on this clear June morning. Schools of baitfish moved in synchronized clouds, and a pair of remoras glided past, looking for larger marine life to accompany. At 50 feet, Mike paused to adjust his buoyancy and check his compass bearing. The artificial reef structure they were studying should be approximately 200 yards to the southeast. This collection of deliberately submerged concrete structures had been placed 5 years ago as part of a coastal habitat restoration project. Now encrusted with barnacles, corals, and sponges, it formed a thriving ecosystem that attracted a variety of marine species, including the bull sharks Mike was studying. He kicked steadily through the water, conserving energy with efficient fin movements. His breathing was measured and rhythmic, each exhalation creating a silver bubble trail that raced upward toward the surface. The research equipment in his mesh bag created minimal drag as he swam, and within minutes, the dark outline of the artificial reef appeared ahead. The structure was impressive, a series of concrete pyramids and cylinders arranged in deliberate patterns to maximize habitat creation. Schools of snappers hovered around the structures, while parrotfish methodically scraped algae from the concretions. A southern stingray glided across the sandy bottom, temporarily disappearing in a cloud of silt before re-emerging on the other side of the reef. Mike took several minutes to set up his camera array, anchoring the 3 waterproof housings to weighted tripods that would keep them stable in the current. Each camera was positioned to capture a different angle of the reef, with overlapping fields of view to ensure maximum coverage. Once satisfied with the placement, Mike activated the recording function and checked the status lights. All 3 glowed steady green. Everything was working perfectly. Now came the waiting. Mike settled onto a small patch of sand about 15 yards from the nearest reef structure, kneeling to minimize his movement and disturbance to the environment. His own handheld camera was ready, and he controlled his breathing to reduce the noise and bubbles that might deter the sharks from approaching. 20 minutes passed with only the usual reef activity: fish foraging, crabs scuttling between, hiding spots, the occasional barracuda patrolling the water column above. Mike remained patient. His years of field research had taught him that wildlife observation required equal parts preparation and persistence. The first sign of the shark's arrival wasn't visual, but behavioral. The smaller fish suddenly tightened their schools, moving in more coordinated patterns. A trio of remoras that had been lazily circling the reef suddenly darted toward the blue water beyond Mike's field of vision. These were telltale indications that a large predator was approaching. Mike felt his heart rate increase slightly, not from fear, but from the academic excitement that still gripped him after all these years in the field. He raised his camera, focusing in the direction the smaller fish were watching. She appeared like a gray phantom, a female bull shark approximately 8 feet long, moving with the effortless power that made these animals such successful hunters. Her pectoral fins were slightly downturned, and her broad snout pushed forward as she swam in a deliberate patrol pattern around the reef. Mike estimated her weight at around 300 pounds, not the largest bull shark he'd encountered, but still an impressive specimen. Through his viewfinder, Mike documented the shark's movements, noting the distinctive scarring pattern along her right gill slits that would help identify her in future encounters. Her movements were confident but unhurried, suggesting she wasn't actively hunting at the moment, but rather investigating the territory. A second bull shark appeared from the opposite direction, slightly smaller at perhaps 7 feet. Mike shifted his position slightly to capture both animals in his frame. The newcomer was a male, identifiable by the claspers visible along his pelvic region. The 2 sharks acknowledged each other with subtle shifts in their swimming patterns, but showed no aggression or particular interest in one another. This was precisely the kind of natural behavior Mike had hoped to document. Bull sharks had a reputation for aggression toward humans, but these interactions between their own species were less frequently observed and documented. His research aimed to better understand their social hierarchies, territorial behaviors, and communication methods. For nearly 30 minutes, Mike remained in his observational position, recording as the shark population around the reef grew to 4 individuals. The 2 he'd already seen, plus 2 more males of similar size. They established a loose circuit around the reef structure, occasionally diverting to investigate particular features, but generally maintaining their patrol. The original female, which Mike had mentally dubbed Scarlet for the gill scarring, seemed to hold a dominant position. The other sharks gave her slightly more space and adjusted their own swimming patterns to avoid crossing directly in front of her path. This behavioral hierarchy was fascinating and exactly the kind of data that could help unravel the complex social structures of these often misunderstood predators. Mike checked his dive computer. He'd been down for 42 minutes and still had adequate air supply. The bull sharks showed no signs of distress at his presence, having apparently categorized him as neither threat nor prey. Their acceptance allowed for the pure observational research that was most valuable. He was so focused on recording the established group of 4 sharks that he failed to immediately notice the 5th shark approaching from behind him. The first indication came when the 4 sharks he was observing suddenly altered their swimming patterns, their attention shifting to a point beyond Mike's position. He turned slowly, camera still recording, and found himself face to face with the largest bull shark he'd encountered in his career. This new arrival was a female, easily 9.5 feet long, with a particularly robust girth that suggested she might be pregnant. Her skin had the typical gray-brown coloration of Carcharinus lucus, but with unusually pronounced countershading, The line between her darker dorsal surface and lighter ventral region was sharp and distinctive. What immediately caught Mike's attention, however, was her swimming pattern. Unlike the measured, deliberate movements of the other sharks, this individual moved with a more erratic, angular approach. Mike knew the signs of agitated shark behavior: sharper turns, more pronounced swimming motions, lowered pectoral fins. This shark was displaying all of them. Whether triggered by territorial instincts, hunger, or some other stimulus, she was not in the same calm, investigative state as the others. Maintaining his composure, Mike slowly began to position himself closer to the reef structure, wanting to avoid being in open water with an apparently agitated bull shark. His movements were deliberate and smooth, no sudden gestures or kicks that might trigger a predatory response. The massive female tracked his movement, adjusting her own course to maintain a direct line toward him. The 4 other bull sharks had now altered their behavior as well, swimming in tighter, faster circuits. The dynamic Mike had been observing had clearly shifted with the arrival of this larger individual. He continued filming, even as he retreated, knowing that this interaction, however concerning, was valuable research data. The large female closed the distance more quickly than Mike anticipated. She circled once quickly, at a distance of about 10 feet, close enough that Mike could see the dark pupil of her right eye as she passed. Bull sharks had relatively small eyes compared to other shark species, but they conveyed a focused intensity that was unmistakable. This wasn't the mindless killer of popular imagination, but a complex predator making calculated assessments. For a moment, she disappeared from view behind him. Mike pivoted as smoothly as his equipment would allow, trying to keep the shark in sight. The cardinal rule of shark diving was never to lose visual contact with the animal. He caught a glimpse of her tail disappearing into the blue haze at the edge of visibility, and then she was gone. Mike held his position, scanning the water in all directions. The other 4 sharks continued their circling, but at a greater distance now. The sudden disappearance of the large female was concerning. Bull sharks were known to make investigative passes before deciding whether to attack, and losing sight of her removed his ability to predict and respond to her movements. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. Mike's training told him to begin a controlled ascent, not rushing to the surface, which could attract pursuit, but steadily making his way up and away from the area. He checked his dive computer one final time, noting his depth and remaining air supply, and began to swim upward at a modest angle, maintaining his heading toward the boat. He had ascended perhaps 10 feet when movement below caught his attention. The large female had returned and was now directly beneath him, looking up with that same unsettling focus. In open water, without the reef's protection or a clear escape route, Mike felt a primal vulnerability that his scientific mindset couldn't entirely suppress. The shark accelerated upward with a powerful thrust of her tail. Mike had just enough time to bring his camera housing between himself and the approaching shark, a reflexive attempt at protection rather than continued documentation. The impact came with shocking force, driving him backward through the water. The bull shark's broad snout struck the camera housing, her momentum carrying both predator and researcher in a tumbling tangle. In that chaotic moment, Mike felt a searing pain along his left calf. The shark's teeth had found flesh, slicing through his 5mm neoprene wetsuit and into the muscle beneath. The initial bite wasn't the sustained thrashing attack often depicted in media, but rather a quick, investigative sample, powerful enough to cause significant damage, but not the sustained grip that would drag him deeper. Blood clouded the water as Mike struggled to orient himself. His training had covered shark encounters: maintain eye contact, use equipment as a buffer, strike at sensitive areas like the eyes or gills if necessary, but the reality was far more disorienting than any simulation. The pain was immediate and intense, his leg feeling as though it had been slashed with heated metal. The shark circled back more quickly this time, drawn by the blood now pulsing from Mike's wounded leg. His regulator had been knocked from his mouth during the initial impact, and he fumbled to replace it, fighting against the dual threats of drowning and a second attack. He managed to get the mouthpiece between his lips just as the shark approached again. This time Mike struck outward with the heavy camera housing, connecting solidly with the shark's snout. The impact seemed to momentarily redirect the predator, buying precious seconds. He began kicking powerfully with his uninjured leg, ascending toward the surface in an urgent but controlled manner, aware that a panicked rush could further trigger predatory response. The pain in his leg was becoming more pronounced as the initial shock wore off. Through the clouded water, he could see the substantial laceration running from his knee to ankle, blood continuing to seep into the surrounding water. His buoyancy compensator helped maintain his ascent, but each kick with his good leg sent waves of agony through the injured one. At 40 feet, he paused briefly for a safety stop, scanning continuously for the shark's return. The water below him was now a diffuse red cloud that obscured his vision, but there was no sign of the massive bull shark. The other 4 sharks had scattered entirely, perhaps deterred by the sudden violence or possibly avoiding the dominant female's feeding zone. Mike's dive computer beeped urgently. His heart rate and breathing had accelerated to dangerous levels. The combination of physical exertion, blood loss, and adrenaline was placing enormous stress on his system. He needed to surface and receive medical attention quickly, but he also needed to avoid decompression sickness from ascending too rapidly. After 15 seconds at his safety stop, far shorter than the recommended time but necessary given the circumstances, Mike continued his ascent. The sunlight from the surface grew brighter, a beacon of safety that seemed simultaneously close and impossibly distant. His left leg had gone from searing pain to a troubling numbness, and he worried about the severity of the damage to muscles, tendons, and potentially arteries. As he approached the surface, the dark shadow of the research vessel came into view. Mike fumbled for his emergency signaling device, activating the surface marker buoy that would alert Carlos and Justine to his position and distress. The orange inflatable tube shot upward, breaking the surface several yards from the boat. Mike's head finally cleared the water, and he gasped for air, spitting out his regulator. "Shark attack!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and strained. "I'm hit!" The commotion on the boat was immediate. Carlos's voice carried across the water. "Hang on, Mike, we're coming." The boat's engine roared to life, and within moments the vessel was alongside him. Carlos leaned over the side, extending a rescue hook toward Mike's BCD. "Grab hold, don't try to swim." Mike grasped the hook with one hand, still trying to keep weight off his injured leg. The water around him was tinged pink with diluted blood. As Carlos and Justine began to haul him toward the boat, Mike glanced back into the depths below. There, just at the edge of visibility, the massive female bull shark circled slowly. Their eyes met one final time. Predator and prey. Researcher. And subject. In a moment of primitive connection that transcended scientific categorization. Then, with a powerful sweep of her tail, she turned and disappeared into the deeper water, leaving behind only diffusing clouds of blood and questions without answers. "Jesus Christ," breathed Justine, as they hauled Mike over the gunwale and onto the deck. His wetsuit was torn along the left leg, the neoprene peeled back to reveal a jagged laceration, approximately 12 inches long and alarmingly deep in places. Blood pulsed from the wound with each heartbeat, not the gushing of arterial damage, but still significant enough to be life-threatening, if not quickly addressed. Carlos was already in motion, grabbing the first aid kit from its mounting on the cabin wall. "Justine, radio the Coast Guard. Tell them we have a level 1 medical emergency. Shark attack with severe laceration, significant blood loss. We're 11 miles southwest of St. Pete Beach." Justine's hands trembled as she reached for the radio, her academic knowledge of shark behavior suddenly insufficient preparation for the reality of her mentor bleeding on the deck before her. "This is research vessel Mako requesting immediate assistance," she began, her voice steadying as she focused on the protocol. "We have a diver with shark bite injuries, severe bleeding." Mike lay on his back, staring up at the cloudless June sky as shock began to set in. The pain had receded to a dull throb, replaced by a spreading coldness that he recognized as a dangerous sign. His scientific mind continued to function alongside the animal panic, cataloging symptoms, assessing blood loss, calculating survival probabilities. "Bull shark," he managed to say as Carlos cut away the remains of his wetsuit. "Female, 9.5 feet. Possibly pregnant." "Save your strength," Carlos replied, wrapping a pressure bandage around the worst section of the wound. "Coast Guard's dispatching a helicopter. 20 minutes out." Mike nodded weakly. "Camera. Did the housing survive?" Justine glanced at the equipment they'd pulled aboard with him. The underwater housing was dented and cracked along one side, the side he'd used to fend off the second attack, but appeared otherwise intact. "I think so." "Good," Mike whispered. "The footage. Important for the research. Carlos tightened the tourniquet above Mike's knee, stemming the worst of the bleeding but intensifying the pain. Worry about the research later. Right now we need to keep you stable. The next 20 minutes passed in a haze of pain and clinical intervention. Carlos and Justine worked methodically to control the bleeding, elevate the injured leg, and monitor Mike's vital signs. They covered him with an emergency blanket to combat shock and administered oxygen from the boat's emergency supply. Throughout it all, Mike drifted between lucid analysis of his situation and foggy disconnection from reality. The distinctive thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors finally broke through the ambient sounds of waves against the hull. A Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin appeared overhead, hovering at a safe distance before lowering a rescue basket and medic. The coordination between the boat crew and aircraft was practiced and efficient, evidence of the unfortunately regular occurrence of marine emergencies along the Florida coast. The Coast Guard medic, a compact woman with quick, efficient movements, made a rapid assessment of Mike's condition. Multiple lacerations to the left calf and knee, significant tissue damage, possible arterial involvement, she reported into her helmet microphone. Patient is conscious, but showing signs of Class 2 hemorrhagic shock. Pressure bandages applied by the boat crew have controlled immediate bleeding. Preparing for evacuation. Mike tried to focus on her name tag, Rodriguez, as she administered an IV line and injected what he assumed was a painkiller and antibiotic combination. The relief was almost immediate, a warm wave that pushed back the cold edges of shock. "Dr. Donovan," Rodriguez said, leaning close to ensure he could hear her over the helicopter noise, "we're going to move you into the rescue basket. It will be uncomfortable, but we need to get you to the trauma center as quickly as possible." Mike managed a nod. "My research assistant," he began. "Your team will follow by boat," Rodriguez assured him. "Right now, you're the priority." The transfer to the rescue basket was indeed agonizing, despite the medication. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through his injured leg. Once secured, Mike felt the basket being lifted, swinging slightly as it cleared the boat's railing and began its ascent to the hovering helicopter. As he was raised higher, Mike had a momentary bird's-eye view of the research vessel below, of Carlos and Justine looking upward, of the spreading stain of his blood still visible on the white deck. Beyond them, the Gulf of Mexico stretched in endless blue, indifferent to the drama playing out upon its surface. Somewhere below those waters, the bull shark continued her ancient patterns, her brief interaction with him nothing more than a blip in millions of years of evolutionary programming. The helicopter interior was a cramped space of medical equipment and focused activity. A second medic joined Rodriguez in stabilizing Mike for transport, attaching monitors, adjusting the IV flow, and redressing the wound with more advanced medical supplies than had been available on the boat. "Tampa General Trauma Center has been notified," the pilot's voice came through the intercom. "ETA 12 minutes. Mike closed his eyes, allowing the medication to carry him into a state of semi-consciousness. The rhythmic vibration of the helicopter blended with the steady beep of monitoring equipment, creating a mechanical lullaby that contrasted sharply with the primal violence he'd experienced underwater. His last coherent thought before surrendering to the medication was that he would need to revise the section of his research paper addressing predatory behavior in female bull sharks. The data set had just expanded considerably, with him as both observer and subject. The trauma bay at Tampa General Hospital was organized chaos, a choreographed emergency response that had been refined through countless similar situations. Florida's position as one of the shark attack capitals of the world meant that the medical staff had specific protocols for marine predator injuries. Shark attack victim, 36-year-old male, laceration to left lower extremity, approximately 20% blood volume loss in the field, pressure bandages and tourniquet applied, 2 liters of fluid administered during transport, recited the Coast Guard medic as they transferred Mike to the hospital gurney. The trauma team moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away the remaining wetsuit, establishing new IV lines, connecting monitoring equipment, and prepping for immediate surgery. A trauma surgeon assessed the wound while nurses catalogued vital signs and a radiology technician wheeled in a portable X-ray machine. "Dr. Donovan, can you hear me?" The trauma surgeon was a middle-aged man with steady hands and calm eyes, visible above his. "Surgical mask. I'm Dr. Patel. You've sustained a significant shark bite injury, but you're stable. We're taking you to surgery to repair the damage to your leg. Do you understand? Mike managed a weak nod. The painkiller had dulled the worst of the agony, but every movement still sent spikes of pain through his left leg. Bull shark, he mumbled. Not the shark's fault. Natural behavior. Dr. Patel's eyes crinkled slightly in what might have been a smile behind his mask. We'll debate marine biology later. Right now, let's focus on getting you patched up. The operating room lights were blindingly bright after the relative dimness of the trauma bay. The anesthesiologist explained the procedure as the surgical team prepared the site. We're going to put you under general anesthesia, Dr. Donovan. When you wake up, the wound will be repaired, but you've got a long recovery ahead. Count backward from 10 for me, please. 10, 9, 8. Mike felt the cold rush of medication through his IV, and then darkness claimed him. The recovery room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional murmur of nursing staff. Mike surfaced slowly from anesthesia, his thoughts fragmented and disjointed. The pain in his leg was muted, present but distant like thunder on the horizon rather than directly overhead. Welcome back, Dr. Donovan. A nurse appeared at his bedside, checking the monitors and adjusting his IV. Surgery went well. Dr. Patel will be by shortly to explain everything, but you're going to be okay. My leg! Mike's voice was hoarse from the intubation tube that had been removed after surgery. Still attached, the nurse replied with a gentle smile, though you'll have quite a story to tell at marine biology conferences. Dr. Patel arrived 30 minutes later, carrying a tablet that presumably contained Mike's medical information. Good to see you awake, Dr. Donovan. How's the pain level on a scale of 1 to 10? 4, Mike replied after a moment's consideration. Manageable. That's the fentanyl talking, Dr. Patel said with a wry smile. We'll transition you to oral pain management later today. He pulled up a chair beside the bed. Let's talk about your injury and what we did to address it. Over the next several minutes, Dr. Patel outlined the damage and repair in clinical detail that Mike, with his scientific background, both appreciated and found somewhat surreal when applied to his own body. The bull shark's teeth had lacerated approximately 12 inches of his left calf, cutting through skin, subcutaneous, fat, and into the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles. Fortunately, the popliteal artery had been spared, though several smaller blood vessels had been severed. The peroneal nerve had sustained minor damage, which might result in some numbness or weakness, but was expected to regenerate over time. We debrided the wound, removed several tooth fragments, and repaired the muscle damage, Dr. Patel continued. The skin closure required 67 stitches in total. We've started you on broad-spectrum antibiotics. The bacterial load in shark bites can be significant. You're looking at a minimum of 6 weeks before weight-bearing, followed by extensive physical therapy. Will I dive again? Mike asked, the question emerging unbidden from some deep place of concern. Dr. Patel's expression was measured. Medically speaking, there's no reason you couldn't eventually return to diving. The muscle damage will heal, though with some scarring, and we expect good nerve recovery. But that's a decision that involves more than physical healing. He paused. Many shark attack survivors struggle with psychological barriers to returning to the water. Mike nodded slowly. The medical prognosis was better than he'd feared, but the psychological impact remained an unknown quantity. I understand. Thank you, Doctor. Your research assistant and boat captain are waiting to see you, Dr. Patel added. I've told them 10 minutes only. You need rest, and there's a Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation officer who wants to take your statement. When you're up to it. Send Justine and Carlos in, Mike said, and I'll talk to FWC whenever they're ready. The incident needs to be properly documented. Justine's eyes were red-rimmed when she entered the room, evidence of recent tears despite her attempt at professional composure. Carlos looked haggard, but relieved to see Mike conscious and relatively alert. You look better than the last time we saw you, Carlos said, managing a smile, though that's not saying much. The camera housing, Mike said, bypassing small talk. Did it survive? Was the footage recoverable? Justine exchanged a glance with Carlos before answering. The main housing is cracked, but the memory card was intact. I've downloaded everything to the lab server. It's extraordinary footage. Mike, you captured the entire encounter, including the initial approach and the bite, and the stationary cameras. Still recording when we left, Carlos said. Coast Guard advised against us staying out there after the attack, but they're programmed to stop at the 6-hour mark. We can retrieve them tomorrow if you want." Mike nodded, already thinking about the research implications. The footage needs to be analyzed. Behavior before, during, and after the attack. This could be the most complete documentation of a bull shark investigation bite ever recorded. "The investigation bite?" Justine's voice held a note of disbelief. "Mike, you nearly died." "The shark wasn't hunting me," Mike explained, his academic mind finding comfort in the analysis. "If she had been, the attack would have been far more sustained. This was an investigative bite, assessing whether I was appropriate prey. Once she determined I wasn't, she disengaged. After taking a chunk of your leg," Carlos pointed out. "That's the nature of how sharks investigate, with their mouths. It's why so many attacks on humans are single bites, rather than prolonged feeding attempts." Even as he spoke, Mike recognized the strangeness of his clinical detachment. He was discussing his own injury, as though it was simply another data point in his research. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Officer Martinez from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. She was a tall woman with the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. "Dr. Donovan," she said with a nod. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I need to document the incident for our records. All shark attacks in Florida waters are catalogued to help identify patterns and potential risk areas." Mike gave as detailed an account as he could, describing the shark's appearance, behavior, and the circumstances leading up to the attack. Officer Martinez took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about location, water conditions, and wildlife patterns observed before the incident. "And you were conducting approved research?" she asked. "Yes," Mike confirmed. "We have all necessary permits from NOAA and the state of Florida." This was part of a 3-year behavioral study of bull shark populations in Tampa Bay and surrounding Gulf waters. Officer Martinez nodded. "We'll classify this as a provoked attack then, since you were in the water specifically to observe sharks." "That's not entirely accurate," Mike objected. "I wasn't interfering with the sharks or baiting them. I was engaged in passive observation. State guidelines consider any in-water activity specifically focused on shark observation as provoked for classification purposes," Martinez explained. "It doesn't imply you did anything wrong, just that you were intentionally in proximity to the animals." The distinction bothered Mike's scientific sensibilities, but didn't seem worth arguing in his current condition. "Will there be any management response to the attack?" he asked, concerned about potential negative impacts on the shark population he studied. "Localized advisory for the area. Standard procedure for 2 weeks, Martinez replied. "No targeted removal efforts for the shark involved. Florida stopped those kinds of responses years ago, recognizing that sharks are following natural behavior patterns in their native habitat." Mike felt a measure of relief. 20 years ago, there might have been calls for a shark hunt or culling operation after such an attack. The evolution of public and institutional understanding about shark behavior represented progress, even if it came too late for his left calf muscle. After Officer Martinez left, Dr. Patel returned to shoo away Justine and Carlos, insisting that Mike needed rest. "They can come back tomorrow," he told them firmly. "Dr. Donovan isn't going anywhere for at least 3 days." Alone in the hospital room, Mike finally had time to process what had happened. The clinical discussions, the detailed medical explanations, and the research implications had provided a buffer against the raw, emotional impact of the attack. Now, as the day's adrenaline faded and the pain medication created a slight haziness, that buffer began to dissolve. He had come face to face with one of the ocean's apex predators and survived, but only because the shark had chosen to disengage. The realization of his own vulnerability, of how quickly life could be altered or ended by forces beyond his control, settled over him like a cold current. The media would likely pick up the story. Local news, at minimum, always reported shark attacks, but public interest would be fleeting. By next week, it would be forgotten except by those directly involved. The shark would continue patrolling her territory, perhaps eventually giving birth to pups that would carry on the ancient lineage of Carcharinus lucus. And he would be left with scars and a new respect for the fine line between observer and participant in nature's drama. The next morning brought a parade of medical staff, nurses checking vital signs, doctors assessing wound healing, physical therapists outlining future rehabilitation plans. Mike's left leg was heavily bandaged, elevated on pillows, and periodically connected to a machine that gently compressed and released to promote circulation and prevent blood clots. Dr. Patel arrived mid-morning with news. "Cultures from your wound came back negative for concerning bacteria," he reported. "We'll continue the antibiotics as a precaution, but this is good news. Shark bites can introduce some nasty infections." "When can I start physical therapy?" Mike asked, already thinking about recovery timelines and returning to his research. "Eager to get back in the water?" Dr. Patel asked with a raised eyebrow. "Eager to walk normally again," Mike clarified, though he had been thinking about diving as well. "My research timeline doesn't allow for extended downtime." "The wound needs to heal before we can begin aggressive rehabilitation," Dr. Patel explained. "Initial wound care and gentle range of motion exercises can start in about a week. Serious physical therapy begins after 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how you heal." The prognosis was discouraging. Half a summer's research season lost, but better than the alternatives Mike had contemplated during darker moments of the previous night. He could have lost the leg entirely or worse. As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Patel added, "You're fortunate, you know. Bull shark bites typically cause more damage than what you sustained. Their dental structure and bite force are among the most destructive in the shark world." "I'm aware," Mike replied with the wry smile of someone who had perhaps been too academically familiar with a danger that had become suddenly personal. "My research includes cataloging bite patterns and force calculations for different species." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A hospital administrator entered, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Dr. Donovan, I'm sorry to bother you, but there are several news outlets requesting interviews. We've declined on your behalf, but I wanted to confirm that's your preference." Mike hadn't considered the media angle. While shark attacks weren't uncommon in Florida waters, the state typically recorded more incidents than anywhere else in the world. They still generated public interest, particularly when they involved researchers studying the very animals that had attacked them. After a moment's consideration, Mike responded, "I'll speak with one local outlet briefly, on the condition that the focus remains on the research and conservation aspects, not sensationalizing the attack." The administrator nodded. "I'll arrange something for tomorrow if Dr. Patel approves." "A brief interview only," Dr. Patel conceded, "and I reserve the right to end it if I feel it's taxing my patient." After they left, Mike requested his laptop from the personal items that had been transported from the research vessel. Despite the discomfort of his position and the lingering effects of pain medication, he felt compelled to review the footage from yesterday's encounter. The video began with standard research documentation, Mike's voice noting the date, location, depth, and water conditions. The initial shark appearances played out exactly as he remembered, with the 4 bull sharks establishing their patrol pattern around the artificial reef. The footage quality was excellent, capturing subtle details of their movement patterns and social interactions. Then came the approach of the large female, the one Mike had mentally named Apex during his more lucid hospital moments. Seeing the encounter from the camera's perspective was surreal. The video showed what his situational awareness had missed. The female had actually made 2 investigative passes behind him before the close approach that he had noticed. Her behavior showed classic signs of increasing interest: tighter circles, more direct approaches, the lowered pectoral fins that indicated heightened arousal. The attack itself was shockingly swift. The camera captured the shark's acceleration, the impact, and then chaotic tumbling as the bite occurred. What had seemed like an eternity in the moment lasted less than 4 seconds on video. The final shot, captured as Mike began his ascent, showed the shark circling at a distance, her behavior now more measured, as though the investigative bite had satisfied her assessment process. Mike watched the footage 3 times, taking notes despite his discomfort. By the 3rd viewing, he was analyzing the incident with scientific detachment, noting behavioral cues he had missed, cataloging the precise approach angle, estimating bite force based on the damage to his wetsuit visible in the frame. This clinical analysis provided emotional distance from the trauma, transforming personal experience into research data. He was so absorbed in the footage that he didn't notice Justine enter until she spoke. "I thought you'd be resting, not working." Her tone carried a mixture of exasperation and concern. "This is important documentation," Mike replied without looking up. "Most shark attack analyses rely on victim recollection, which is notoriously unreliable due to trauma and adrenaline. We have complete video of the encounter from initial approach through the attack itself. Justine set down the bag she was carrying, fresh clothes and toiletries from Mike's apartment, he presumed, and pulled a chair next to the bed. I reviewed the footage too, she said quietly. It's difficult to watch when you know the person being bitten. That comment finally pulled Mike's attention from the screen. I'm sorry. I didn't consider how this would affect you and Carlos. We thought we were going to lose you, Justine admitted, when we pulled you into the boat and saw the blood. She trailed off, then visibly composed herself. The university called this morning. Dean Roberts wants to discuss incident protocols and whether the research methodology needs revision. Mike frowned. The protocols were sound. This was a known risk of the work we do. A risk that nearly killed you, Justine pointed out. The university has liability concerns, not to mention genuine concern for their faculty's safety. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a physical therapist who insisted on demonstrating some gentle exercises Mike could perform in bed to maintain circulation and prevent muscle atrophy. By the time she left, Justine had departed as well, leaving a note saying she would return the following day with updates from the research team. The afternoon brought a visit from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a hospital psychologist who specialized in trauma counseling. It's standard procedure for shark attack survivors, she explained, when Mike questioned the necessity of her visit. Physical recovery is only part of the healing process. Mike found himself surprisingly willing to discuss the psychological aspects of the attack. Dr. Vasquez listened attentively as he described not just the incident itself, but his analytical response to it. You're processing this very intellectually, she observed. That's not unusual for people with scientific backgrounds, but there's often an emotional response that emerges later. I'm not denying the emotional impact, Mike clarified. I'm just finding it useful to examine the event scientifically. That's a valid coping mechanism, Dr. Vasquez acknowledged, but I'd encourage you to also make space for less analytical reactions. Many survivors experience post-traumatic stress, including flashbacks, anxiety about water, or nightmares. Mike nodded, though he wasn't convinced he would follow the typical pattern. His relationship with sharks had always been one of respect, rather than fear, and he understood the attack in its biological context. Still, he recognized the value in having professional support available if his responses changed during recovery. The local news interview the following day was both better and worse than Mike had anticipated. The reporter, a woman named Sarah Chen from the Tampa Bay Herald, asked thoughtful questions about his research and seemed genuinely interested in the scientific aspects of the encounter. However, she also pressed for emotional details about the attack itself, clearly hoping for dramatic quotes to lead her story. "Were you afraid you were going to die?" she asked, her tone gentle but persistent. "I was focused on applying my training," Mike replied, sidestepping the emotional bait. "Anyone who works with large predators understands the risks and prepares for potential emergencies. And will you go back in the water with sharks after this?" The question gave Mike pause, not because he hadn't considered it, but because he realized he hadn't fully confronted his own answer. "My research is important for understanding and protecting these animals," he said finally. "Once I've recovered physically, I expect to continue that work in whatever capacity is most effective." The published article the next morning was relatively balanced, though the headline, "Shark Researcher Becomes Shark Bait in Tampa Bay Attack," made Mike wince. The story included accurate information about bull shark behavior and habitat, but also emphasized the dramatic aspects of the rescue and the severity of Mike's injuries. Accompanying photographs showed the research vessel, the hospital exterior, and stock footage of a bull shark that wasn't even the same gender as the one that had bitten him. What bothered Mike most was the article's framing of the incident as a cautionary tale rather than a research opportunity. Chen had written, "Dr. Donovan's harrowing experience serves as a reminder of the dangers lurking in Florida's waters, even for those who understand these predators best." That the narrative reinforced the very fears and misconceptions that Mike's research aimed to address, that sharks were lurking threats rather than normal inhabitants of a marine ecosystem that humans occasionally entered. The local television news took an even more sensationalistic approach, with the anchor introducing the story as a scientist's nightmare when the subject of his research turned the tables. They used dramatic music, red-tinted footage of generic shark behavior, and emphasized that this was the third shark attack along the Florida coast this year. The media coverage, limited though it was to local outlets, brought a surge of messages from colleagues, friends, and even some shark conservation organizations. Most were supportive, expressing concern for his recovery and appreciation for his measured public comments about the attack. A few researchers requested access to the video footage for their own work on predatory behavior and human-shark interactions. By the third day after the attack, Mike was cleared for discharge from the hospital with a comprehensive home care plan. He would need twice-weekly visits to a wound care specialist, daily physical therapy exercises, and assistance with basic activities until he could safely navigate on crutches. His left leg was immobilized in a specialized brace that both protected the wound and maintained proper alignment for healing. Justine volunteered to drive him home and help get him settled. Carlos stocked your refrigerator and set up a temporary bed in your living room, she explained as they left the hospital. The whole department has created a meal rotation for the next 2 weeks. The support was touching, but also somewhat uncomfortable for Mike, who had always maintained a certain professional distance from colleagues. That's not necessary, he said. I can manage with delivery services. It's not just about the food, Justine replied as she helped him into her car. People care about you, and this gives them a way to show it. Let them help. The drive to Mike's small bungalow near Gulfport took them along the coastline. Mike found himself watching the water, visible in flashes between buildings with a new awareness. For years he had looked at the Gulf and thought primarily of the ecosystems beneath its surface, the research opportunities it presented. Now, he registered its dangers more acutely, not with fear exactly, but with a recalibrated respect. His home had indeed been prepared for his return. The living room transformed into a recovery space with a hospital bed, side tables organized with medications and wound care supplies, and a stack of recent academic journals on shark behavior that someone had thoughtfully collected for him. The department meeting is tomorrow, Justine mentioned as she helped him settle. They're discussing the continuation of the research project. Would you like me to attend as your proxy? Mike shook his head. I'll call in. This is my research. I should be part of that conversation. The department meeting the following morning was predictably difficult. Via video conference, Mike found himself defending the research protocols and the value of the project against concerns about safety and liability. Dean Roberts was sympathetic but firm. The university cannot authorize a return to in-water research for this project until we've completed a full safety review, he explained. And frankly, Mike, you won't be medically cleared for diving for months anyway. The stationary camera, Horace, can be deployed and retrieved from the boat, Mike argued. The data collection doesn't require me to be in the water. Dr. Harriet Chen, the department head, intervened. No one is suggesting terminating the research, Mike. We're talking about modifications and additional safety measures. The compromise eventually reached was one Mike could live with. The project would continue with enhanced safety protocols, including a second safety diver whenever human observers were in the water, increased standoff distances from large sharks, and improved emergency response equipment on the research vessel. In the meantime, while Mike recovered, the team would focus on analyzing existing footage, including the attack documentation, and maintaining the stationary camera arrays using boat-based deployment. Over the next several weeks, Mike's life fell into a new rhythm dictated by his recovery. Mornings were consumed by physical therapy exercises that became increasingly demanding as his wound healed. Afternoons were dedicated to academic work, analyzing footage, writing sections of research papers, and video conferencing with his team as they continued modified field operations. The evenings, however, brought unexpected challenges. As Dr. Vasquez had predicted, the emotional processing of the attack emerged as the initial shock faded. Mike experienced vivid dreams of being underwater, of dark shapes approaching from the periphery of his vision. He would wake breathless, his left leg throbbing with phantom pain even as the actual wound steadily improved. This is normal, Dr. Vasquez assured him during their weekly sessions. Your mind is processing the trauma, integrating it into your understanding of yourself and your work. It doesn't feel normal, Mike admitted. I've spent my career studying these animals without fear. Now I'm dreaming about them hunting me. You can respect and understand sharks intellectually while your body and subconscious mind process the very real danger you experienced, she explained. The goal isn't to eliminate these responses, but to acknowledge them while not allowing them to control your choices. By the 6-week mark, Mike's physical recovery had progressed significantly. The wound had closed completely, though the scarring was extensive. A jagged crescent of raised tissue running from just below his knee to his ankle, puckered in places where the deeper bites had required more substantial repairs. He had graduated from a wheelchair to crutches and was beginning more intensive physical therapy to rebuild the damaged muscle. His role in the research project had evolved as well. Unable to participate in fieldwork, he had focused on data analysis and theoretical modeling of bull shark behavior based on the extensive footage collected before and after his attack. The team had continued to monitor the artificial reef site, though no further sightings of the large female apex had been confirmed. The media interest had faded entirely, as Mike had predicted. A brief follow-up piece in the Tampa Bay Herald had noted his recovery and ongoing research, but public attention had moved on to other stories. In scientific circles, however, there was growing interest in the attack footage and the behavioral analysis Mike was developing from it. Dr. Margaret Lee, a renowned shark behaviorist from the University of Miami, had reached out about collaboration. "Your documentation of the pre-attack investigation behavior is the most complete I've ever seen," she wrote in her email. "This could significantly advance our understanding of the triggers for investigative bites." The collaboration with Dr. Lee brought new energy to the project. Her expertise in shark cognition complemented Mike's focus on behavioral patterns, and together they began developing a more nuanced model of how bull sharks made decisions about potential prey. The attack footage, combined with the stationary camera documentation from before and after the incident, provided unprecedented data for their analysis. As the summer transitioned to fall, Mike's physical recovery continued to progress. By October, he was walking with a cane rather than crutches, though his endurance remained limited and his gait slightly uneven due to the muscle damage. His medical team was cautiously optimistic about eventual return to normal function, though they warned that some weakness and nerve sensitivity might be permanent. The psychological recovery had its own timeline. The nightmares gradually decreased in frequency, though they never entirely disappeared. What emerged in their place was a more complex relationship with the ocean and its predators. A relationship that acknowledged both the scientific understanding Mike had built over his career and the visceral experience of being on the wrong side of the predator-prey equation. In late October, 11 weeks after the attack, Mike visited the marina where the research vessel was docked. He hadn't been on the water since that June day, and simply standing on the dock, smelling the salt air and feeling the slight movement beneath his feet brought a rush of conflicting emotions. "You don't have to go out today," Justine said, standing beside him. "We can just check the equipment and head back." Mike shook his head. "I need to do this." He took a breath. "Not diving, not yet, but I need to be on the water again." The trip was a short one, just a circuit of the harbor and a brief venture into the open bay. Mike stood at the rail, his weight braced against his cane, watching the water slip past. Beneath that surface was an entire world that had defined his professional life, a world he understood through data and observation, but had experienced in a new and profound way. "Will you dive again?" Carlos asked quietly, joining him at the rail. Mike considered the question carefully. 3 months ago, he would have answered immediately in the affirmative. Now, he recognized the complexity of the decision, the balance between his scientific commitment and the psychological reality of trauma. "Yes," he said finally. "Not tomorrow and maybe not exactly as before, but yes, I'll dive again." The research would continue, adapted to incorporate what they had learned from the attack. The data would advance scientific understanding of bull shark behavior, potentially contributing to both conservation efforts and public safety. The scarring on Mike's leg would fade somewhat, but never disappear entirely, a permanent record of his encounter with apex. And somewhere in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, a large female bull shark continued her ancient patterns, feeding, potentially breeding, moving through her environment with the perfect adaptation of millions of years of evolution. Her brief encounter with the human researcher had left a mark on him that would last a lifetime, but for her, it had been merely a moment of curiosity, an investigation of something that had entered her world. She swam on, untroubled by media, narratives or scientific analyses, simply being what nature had designed her to be, a perfectly evolved predator, in an ocean that humans only visited but she called home.